Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning. Hello from wherever you are. My name is Dolphin from the GY CAF team, basically. So we are having this first session. It's sort of a COP26 debrief session for basically youth and climate financing capacity building that we have been doing. So we thought that it would be important, before basically we close the year round up, to basically have a sort of debrief of what really happened at COP26 for those who are there and for those who are not able to make it for some reason or the other. Basically, what basically do the outcomes of COP26 mean for young people, especially who are interested or who should be involved on issues of climate finance? So, welcome everyone. And with me, I have a wide range of panelists from Iliana, Katya, Rasta, and Stanford, who will join us. I think he's in the process. So, I think without basically wasting any more time, I would just want to open this session by asking our very experienced panelists what happened at COP26 and how does it reflect on 25 years of negotiations? Because COP26 was packaged as the world's best last chance, of basically doing something meaningful towards climate change. So I will give every one of our audience, starting with Iliana, introduce yourself, what you do, and how it relates to climate finance, and tell us from your perspective whether you're following the side events or the main negotiations, what actually happened at COP26 for those who are there, and how does it reflect on 25 years of negotiations. So, Iliana, I'll give you the floor. Then, yes, Iliana.
Thank you very much, Dauphine. My name is Ilyana. I work as Senior Climate Finance Expert for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy Secretariat. So that's an initiative for those of you that are not familiar that brings together cities through their city leaders and city networks that are committed to ambitious climate action at the territorial level. There are more than 100 partners that we have in 13 regional hubs around the world. So this includes cities from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Middle East, from Europe, North America, so US and Canada, globally. My work essentially is about liaising with the financial institutions to ensure that climate flows go at the local level, and that's where the youth plays a very important role as part of the civil society, as part of community, to voice their concerns, to try to channel finance, and to a certain extent influence how decisions are taken, not only at the local level but also at the central level. The initiative I work for is already engaged into empowering youth in urban planning, solution making through Innovate for Cities. And I will just jump directly to the question: what did happen at COP? Well, maybe as a little bit of intro, and I'm sure my colleagues Katya and Rastre will be filling in. In terms of political engagement, we saw four key strategic documents coming out. There were the two pledges, one that is to halve deforestation and ensure that land use management is done more efficiently. There was also the pledge document for decreasing the emissions of methane, and two more were done. One was the statement for transitioning from coal to clean energy, and finally the commitment to move to 100% green cars and vans. How do I interpret the COP? Well, from a city leader perspective, it was the first time that there was a dedicated day for cities and regions at the built environment. Um, so that was the importance that was given at how to decrease the emissions at that level. If I have to be more critical, again, personally and professionally, it is clear that the climate finance is not flowing at the speed that we need. And could be directed to go to the right places, what the latest report on the status of cities show is that there is a very little finance going, for example, to adaptation and mitigation measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Aliana, for that very wonderful introduction and that key highlight. Your key statement is clearly there's not enough climate finance flowing at the speed that it needs to actually flow. Without taking much of time, I'll give Rasta and then we'll have Katya. So Rasta will introduce what he does and from his perspective, what happened at COP and how does it reflect on 25 years of negotiations. Rasta, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, great. My name's Rashtra. I'm Nepalese. I work on climate finance, and especially now, I do a lot of work on what is called Article 6, which is on carbon finance, which is a subsector of climate finance, if I may say so, mostly in Asia Pacific. So that's the region I am passionate about. I used to be a young environmental activist at like age 11, 12, worked at the zoo, and sort of, like I've always been a climate activist. And yeah, and I think it's been frustrating to follow negotiations, especially as a young person, and sort of seeing where things are now. I think, for me, COP26 has given hope. And obviously, we can, like break down the technicalities and what came out of COP26 in the negotiation processes and the rule book, as well as outside, right? Like outside the UN processes, a lot of leadership from asset owners, or a lot of leadership from cities, private sector engagement and stuff. But I think, to be frankly and to be very, very honest with you, I really don't know how I'm going to assess COP, because there's so much coming out of it, right? Like on one hand, we're hearing of all these pledges and documents, and it feels like we're on the right track. But on the other hand, it also feels like, is anything really happening? And I think finance in particular is sort of like one example, if I may use, where we didn't really see much ambition on COP26. Yeah. So the 100 billion goal is still unmet. I think we're reaching at around 80, depending on how we define climate finance, which is another conversation, right? Loss and damage finance, adaptation finance. I think there's still a lot of room. um, so yeah, look, I mean, I think I have hope, and I think we're on the right track. But only time will tell how COP26 was. But I do think it's given us a standing chance. I think, as the COP president himself put it in his words, and I really very much look forward to this conversation, and especially cities. Ileana, thanks for bringing that up, because obviously, we really need to make sure that financing is reaching the target audience and the target population we actually need to, right? And I think there's a lot of room for innovation for things like municipal green bonds, right? Like municipalities stepping up, cities stepping up, and sort of like looking at finance from a new way, so that we're not stuck in this old way of thinking of, like it's a country oriented process, or it's a private sector oriented process, and talking about how youth can access this, and things like that. So I guess I'll end there. Back to you.
Thank you, Rasta, for that very also insightful introduction. Katya, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today discussing this very important issue, and especially to be among young leaders that are claiming their voice in this table that is so important for us to move to a decent, adequate, resilient future. So I'm Katia Fenibes. I am based in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and I work for the French Development Agency in a program that is called Euroclima Plus. This is the flagship program for cooperation between European Union and Latin American countries in order to implement NDCs contributions at that scale. So on COP, everyone had a lot of expectations on this COP, right? As it coincided with the 5-year NDC's ambition reveal cycle set out by the Paris Agreement, besides being already postponed by 1 year due to the pandemic. And still, as expected, the conference results are not compatible with the degree of the urgency of this climate crisis. What was has dissatisfied many of the engaged stakeholders, and especially those coming from developing countries like me and many of us here. But for the discussions we are having here today, it's worth to develop a more balanced analysis for it to be more constructive. Glasgow was definitely a step forward. We cannot deny it. It closed a climate international negotiation cycle with a reasonable result on shaping Paris Agreement. We can highlight, for instance, the regulation of the Article 6, installing an accounting system for global carbon markets. It also signaled the proximity of the end of the carbon era, raised the complaints against subsidies to other fossil fuels, and kept alive the 1.5-degree goal. It also brought nature in a definitive way into the discussions and connected forests to carbon markets, although technicalities are still not all solved. Glasgow also came out with commitments from some countries on ending deforestation, as we have heard, reducing methane emissions, and a pledge from the financial sector to move trillions of dollars of investments into companies that are committed to net zero emissions. Nevertheless, it's clear that Glasgow Climate Pact's more palatable for rich countries. Glasgow particularly failed, as just said, on the climate finance goal and trust between developed and developing countries. There was considerable anger over the failure by high income nations to meet an earlier pledge to provide the $100 billion in climate finance annually from to 2020, and besides a very limited progress of loss and damage agenda. But to conclude on COP26, I would like to emphasize 3 points. I think it's impossible to not consider the pandemic effect on the availability of financial resources, but economic recovery packages are a unique opportunity to pivot the transition. Adaptation is raising issues on the negotiations table, and finally, climate justice as well. I'll leave you here and we'll have opportunity for more debate.
Thank you, Kasia. I like the way this conversation is starting to take shape, and I like the way you've highlighted basically the pros and cons of the Glasgow Climate Pact, because I think there's a lot of debate on, was it a success, was it a failure, was it just the normal talk and the normal blah blah blah, like Greta puts it. And I actually like how you start to unpack basically into our next question. Does the Paris Agreement, of course, it's considered the greatest milestone, before now, whether we yet to decide whether the Glasgow Climate Pact is now the next big thing after the Paris Agreement. In light of the fact that we didn't meet our $100 billion goal, but looking at the whole Paris Agreement as a package, do you think the Paris Agreement still is the greatest milestone, or do you think the Glasgow Climate Pact has surpassed it or has done beneath it? So what do you think about it in light of every single agenda item, not just looking at climate finance, because climate finance is, sorry to say, for me, a very big disappointment, but looking at Article 6, which was actually a very commendable work. Do you think that the Paris Agreement, in light of what just happened at COP, still is, we can say it's one of the greatest milestones when it comes to climate change? So I'll go over the same cycle. I'll start with you, Iliana, then Rasta, then Katya. Yes, Iliana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dauphine. I agree with Rastra that it remains to be seen what follow up will be done after the Glasgow summit. And we know that the UK government will be also working in the 2022 to deliver these results. A lot of announcements have been made, um, hopeful and promising. But the Paris Agreement, I would say, did lay the foundation for a reporting framework. It did unite the countries towards the same cause to submit their particular plans for the NDCs. That also allowed for the investor world and the financing players to see what is there that can be implemented. So for me, the Paris Agreement and the COP at Paris are still the most meaningful event that has taken place.
Yeah, I can jump in, or I don't.
Yes,
Sorry, were you about to say
yes,
something?
yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. No. No. No look, I think it's a very interesting question, right? Because obviously you're asking us to compare um, two treaties and agreements that actually, in fact, serve very different purposes, and they can't be compared because obviously one is the Paris Agreement, and this one was really supposed to be to operationalize the Paris Agreement, right? So, like finalizing the rule book. So I think it served very different purposes, and both I think complement each other, and I think that was something that was very successful, especially in terms of the rule book. I think negotiations wise, which was something I was following closely as opposed to sort of the high level other things. Um, I think the rule book's very strong now. Um, yes, we still need to make sure that we're implementing it with the highest environmental integrity, be it on Article 6 or something very weirdly that I'm obsessively reading about now is reporting. And I'm going to go on this, but like really sort of like making sure that our numbers and the books are correct, and that we're not sort of looking at it like at emission reductions and things, and what net zero means, right? From multiple interpretations, but we need to really standardize and harmonize what are all these words meaning, and how we report it and stuff. But look, one thing that I do want to point out, a difference between Paris and Glasgow is the bottom up nature. In Paris, the NDCs were still very unequal in terms of ambition. But I do think what we've seen in Glasgow with all the net zero pledges, right, and carbon neutrality pledges, it gives us a very unique opportunity for all countries, developed and developing, to sort of be in the same roadmap to reach the Paris goals. And I think in terms of ambition, what we're seeing is harmony, right? So if all countries or most of the countries are saying net zero by 2050 or 60, mostly 50, then I think that gives us an opportunity which we didn't really have in Paris, did we? But now I think we can really sort of hone into that and figure out what this means for all of us collectively. So I do think, yeah, they complement each other, and yeah, I think I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rasta, for that very insightful introduction. We're joined by Stanford. Stanford, welcome. Just before I introduce Stanford, I'll give Katia a chance to add something to what Iliana and Rasta say. Then I will give Rasta the floor. Not Rasta, rather
Stan.
Stanford. Yes.
Well, I think that the question should not be whether Glasgow overcame Paris in terms of results or not, but to recognize how climate negotiations and governance frameworks have been evolving and what we can learn from the past conference. So, for me, one of the key lessons Glasgow taught us is that we should not expect the climate crisis to be sorted out at COPs. The conference are important platforms to set out a common framework and instruments as a reference to manage the impacts of climate change, and this is their relevance and their function. They promote this gradual incremental progress on solutions each year. But for me, it is only continuous and cumulative decision-making process and climate action in territories that will actually generate the response we are all looking for.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you for that. I'll give Stanford a chance to introduce himself and basically what he does and where he's from. Then I'll also give him this question that sort of summarizes the first two. So my question to you, Mr. Stanford, uh, the $100 billion goal was set in 2015, and the SCF report tells us that we're about 80%. That has been more mobilized. Do you think, in light of what happened at COP26, do you think there's potential to do better? And if there are, in light of course, there's plans to set a new goal, do you think there's potential to do better? And what are some of those gaps that we need to fill? Because basically, it's not something that we're doing maybe basically for the first time, so that we can be able to do better. Of course, even as we look to basically set a new goal and hopefully beat or push, the old goal. So Stanford, the floor is yours.
Okay. All right. I hope you can hear me now. All right, thank you very much. I'll start with an introduction. So I'm a climate finance researcher. Previously, I've worked for the Ministry of Finance. Uh, I've been the focal person within the Ministry of Finance in terms of climate finance, which means I was the link in terms of mobilizing climate finance between government and a whole lot of stakeholders, be it bilaterals, multilaterals, and the like. Then I also have done some work with IIED. This is a London-based company focusing on the Green Climate Fund, assessing the private sector investment facility of the Green Climate Fund. Then going back to your question in terms of the new quantitative goal, I think that well, I think experience should lead us when we are discussing about this new quantitative goal, because as you know that in terms of the 100 billion pledge, the target hasn't been met. Developed countries haven't met their pledges since COP should be COP 15 Copenhagen. You know, nothing has been met in terms of that 100 billion pledge because of a whole lot of reasons. Some of them is because there is no transparency in terms of climate finance flows to developing countries, which means that there has to be a standard in terms of measuring, in terms of definitions of what really constitute climate finance. So you find that even in terms of funding which was mobilized, different organizations come up with different figures in terms of climate finance. So there has to be a standard in terms of measurement, in terms of flows, and that transparency framework. So it's quite difficult also now to start negotiating on a post 2025 goal when developed countries haven't managed to meet this 100 billion pledge. Of course, in terms of planning, we know that we have to plan ahead. We have to plan ahead in terms of what's going to come after this 100 billion pledge. What are the framework countries going to use in terms of the mobilization of climate finance? So I believe that we can go into this post 2025 new quantitative goal with a lot of lessons to learn, lessons that have been seen in terms of this whole 100 billion pledge process, you know. So so it's also, I think it's a positive for countries also, because they know what needs to be done. We all know the gaps that needs to be covered. We all know the instruments that should be extended to developing countries, you know, grant-based financing. We all know that. So I think it makes the work a lot much better, you know, because we already know the gaps that need to be covered. So for me, I think this new pledge has to show that commitment from developed countries in terms of mobilizing this funding. Otherwise, if there's no practical, real commitment in terms of that, then definitely post 2025, we're still going to have these same discussions that we're having on the 100 billion pledge in terms of what's stopping developed countries to meet their target, what's stopping them in terms of extending predictable finance, extending patient finance, grant-based finance, you know. So yeah. So for now, I think these are this is my thinking in terms of the new quantitative goal which is coming post 2025.
Thank you, Stanford, for that highlight. I'd give the speakers a round of applause to basically add or give their perspective on, in light of what how Stanford has tried to highlight, basically the relationship with the new goal that is yet to be set. Iliana.
Well, I will be very quick here in saying that I do agree with what Stan was saying and Rastra before. So there are so many accounting and reporting methodologies that one can take days just to study them or to try to find out what is the right fit. I think something the Global Covenant of Mayors is really proud of is that the local governments that we are working with are very ambitious. So what they have exceeded the 1.5-degree goal and are working towards even higher emission decreases. So that's why the bottom up movement is so important. And also in the light of the recent COP, I would say that while we are working with financial institutions, we do see that they take the green and clean goals they have very seriously, and now there is more knowledge than ever to actually act and to ensure that change happens with the SMEs, through the youth, through the local governments that are championing this change, first with their municipal buildings and then extending the influence. So there is so much that can be done by a local government through the competences that they own, even without waiting for to figure out what is the right accounting methodology at a different level. Of course, these competences and capabilities need to be built. So as long as there is a signal coming, um, I think the society is working itself out. And having worked with cities different in size and in developing and developed countries, it's so exciting to see that one example at the local level can also be implemented in a global north city and vice versa. So to be honest, what is taking place in the developing countries is as inspiring as what is happening in the developed ones.
Thank you. Maybe Rasta, if you have.
Yeah, a couple of things. I 100% agree, right? And I'm a very strong champion of cities and sort of like local governments. And look, that's where the people are. That's the human face of climate change, which we often forget when we talk about a lot of these big things, right? Like the 100 billion and all of this stuff. And I found it interesting because I remember, I think it was 6 years ago or something, and I was talking to some top negotiators, and they always said, look, the 100 billion goal is going to be the buzzword, right? But obviously, like all of us knew this, right? Like, why are we still talking about 100 billion when the need is in trillions, right? So I actually tried to avoid talking so much about this 100 billion and the new public financing goals and stuff because, yeah, we'll talk about it. What I'm seeing that's happening is we're moving in the right direction, right? The market's moving in the right direction. The private sector is interested. So there's so much more that's happening outside of this 100 billion that gives me hope. And I just want to end there because I think it's good to sort of like champion this and for developed countries to sort of like make sure that the pledges are being met, not just in finance but in transparency in reporting and everything else. But I also think like we need to talk about what's happening outside of the 100 billion. And I do think there we are seeing a shift. We are seeing a shift in developing countries realizing that they too need to start financing themselves. So it's not just waiting for finance, right? And I think it was the minister from Pakistan several years ago at the Abu Dhabi Climate Action Summit, and he said, "You know what? We're just tired of negotiating. We're going to start looking into other ways of financing ourselves, right?" And there's so much room for innovation. So I do think this entire notion of the developed and developing countries, it's getting blurred in many ways. I think I'm not trying to undermine the importance, and I think it's extremely important um, to acknowledge the common with differential responsibilities and with the extensions to that. But I also think we need more from everywhere, and it's not just 100 billion and then the next target.
Okay, thank you. Katya?
Yeah, just to go back to this point, we must say that compared with the investment required to avoid the dangerous levels of climate change, the 100 billion pledge is minuscule, and even so, it has not been achieved. The studies have found that actually we need the $1 trillion each year to meet the 2015 Paris Agreement goal. And developing nations will need hundreds of billions of dollars annually to adapt to the warming that is already inevitable. And this is important to stress. It is already inevitable. So we must generate the potential to do better with this new collective, quantified goal on climate finance. And I'm also an optimist. I think this is possible because the pressure for various stakeholders augments. And while more voices come together, both at the conference and on the way up to them, it is possible to believe so. Nevertheless, these voices must be brought up to the decision making table, what is not yet the case. So, despite steps taken to date for improving consistency, comparability, and overall transparency of reporting on climate specific finance, some gaps that still need to be overcome are exactly the definition of methodologies to determine climate specific finance, and these new voices could be part of the auditing process to ensure compliance. Other criticisms and gaps are related to the quality and composition of climate finance flows in the low levels and declining share of grant finance, the underfunding of adaptation, the lack of adequate finance for low development countries and small islands, and obstacles to more direct and smooth access by developing countries to climate finance. In addition, there is also a need to increase predictability and trust in future climate finance flows, strengthen country ownership and effectiveness, and enhance gender responsiveness and tackle loss and damage, as we talked about before. And all these gaps should be addressed for the goal to be effectively realized. And I think we are in the right track, but it's a lot to close in the next cycle yet.
Thank you, Katya, for that the panelist for that very insightful information. I'd like to skip, in the interest of time, I'd like to skip right into a small issue, just touch on it shortest time possible. The balance between adaptation and mitigation, because we've highlighted that we can agree we don't need the money in billions, we need money in trillions, because we need a lot of money. So, and you've said that cities and municipalities, people can't just go ahead to find resources on their own without waiting for this $100 billion target. So as people venture into finding basically resources for their own needs, how do we ensure there's a balance in mitigation and adaptation? Or do they need to basically mobilize resources based on basically the needs of those people mobilizing resources? And do you think that when people, if people are to take that particular pathway where they go and find their own resources, we're not at equal strength. Different countries have different strength. Basically, some have more capacity than others. Do you think that if we focus more on that criteria where we are mobilizing resources, apart from forgetting about the 100 billion target and the dollar, do you think that it might create a bit of more inequality in terms of others might get financing based on their strong adaptive capacity, others might lag behind? Because we saw what happened with the CDM. So I'll pass it over to a round, then we can start with Stanford, because we haven't had for you, then Iliana, then Rasta, then Katya. So Stanford, what's your take on that?
Okay, thank you. I think in terms of the components, adaptation and mitigation, the 50-50, and looking back, we have realized that we can realize that most of the funding has been channeled to mitigation projects. But I think I'm quite happy also to say that the last projects which were funded by the Green Climate Fund, most of them were adaptation projects, which changes the whole trajectory in terms of financing adaptation programs in developing countries. Because in developing countries, most of the problems they are to do with the climate change impacts. So we have to adapt to uh, uh, problems which are being caused by climate change, be it adaptation, be it loss and damage, climate resilient. Those are most of the problems which developing countries are facing. So I think it's just it's a just process if countries are financed, taking into account their needs. I remember also, if we look at the COP26, there were discussions also to do with the vulnerability assessments of countries, whereby reports were saying that, these climate finance flows should also be anchored on scientific analysis. We don't have just to say we want to mobilize 100 billion for climate finance to developing countries. But do we have a scientific study or analysis to match that? Because if we definitely have a scientific analysis, you would definitely be surprised that we need about 6 trillion until 2030 to deal with some of these climate change impacts in developing countries. So I think if there is that scientific analysis process to make sure that the needs of each developing countries are really met, then definitely, and then match that to climate finance flows from developing countries. I think it's a better structure for me. And also, I must add that you realize that in terms of especially projects, the Green Climate Fund, and because of the pressure that has been coming from different stakeholders, especially parties in terms of financing adaptation problems, adaptation projects, and taking into account what happened in the last GCF board, whereby most of the projects were adaptation projects. I think that sets also the tone for what's going to come in the future in terms of giving importance to what matters for developing countries. Because we can't really say we want climate finance, but that climate finance, if it comes, it's channeled to mitigation measures. When most of our problems lie within adaptation, loss, and damage. So I think it's a better approach to look at the needs of each country, and generally in terms of developing countries, it's the problems are adaptation problems which require financing.
Thank you, Stanford. Very interesting. I have questions, but I'll let the panelists take this up. Ileana, your perspective.
Look, I would say it is more difficult to get adaptation projects financed compared to mitigation projects. So the numbers just don't add up. They're not so attractive in terms of financial return. So there are opportunities to generate new revenue streams, to capitalize on the co-benefits that the adaptation projects create. And from my on the ground experience, actually, the countries that need the most adaptation projects have the least. So it's a very, very interesting statistics. What, for example, municipalities in sub-Saharan Africa have been channeling and telling us that on adaptation projects that they prefer to first try and access national government funding. So I guess one conclusion that could be brought out from there is that working at the national scale, it's important for the countries to tune up their regulation and policies to allow for adaptation projects to become interesting. Definitely, again, cities that we are working with are submitting projects to the Green Climate Fund. also the gap fund. So that's a potential avenue for low governments to get their projects financed. And back to you, Dauphine.
Thank you, Rasta.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think two things I'd want to stress out. The first being, um, there's a lot of innovation happening. It is difficult for adaptation, but there's a lot of innovation happening. And I think something good about the rulebook this year was for Article 6, the share of proceeds for 6.4, 5% is set for adaptation fund, which is good, which is very good. It's a very stable supply. And from the perspective of someone working on Article 6 a lot, the market is going to kick off, right? So, and I think we're seeing a lot of that with Article 6.2. There's a voluntary, there's not a requirement for the adaptation fund, um, but I think like countries have an opportunity to do that, as well as Article 6.8 and the African Development Bank, for example, is doing some really innovative work on non-market approaches into adaptation. So I do think there is innovation happening. I just hope we're fast enough, and I hope the market scale up. So there is a steady supply of funding for adaptation fund, and I'm really, really hoping that Article 6 could be that answer.
Mhm.
And let's see how that goes. But also the second thing is when finance doesn't work, we can't solve that with finance, right? If finance is not the panacea of climate change, and this is something that I hear so often is finance will solve things, but no, it won't by itself. So you need policy frameworks, you need carbon pricing, you need to make sure that you're looking into sort of like financing more broadly, and there's so many different elements to it. So I think I'd want to stress that, especially for something like adaptation, we need to look outside as well. We need to look at technology transfer. Let's look at what the Japanese are doing with the joint crediting mechanism, right? Let's look at who are the technologies who are diffusing this technology for adaptation. So there's a lot of different things that also come into place, not just financing. So I do think the second point also needs to be enunciated a bit more in terms of what do we mean by adaptation and what do we mean by adaptation solutions. Yeah, I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you. Finally, Katya.
So to go back to what Liana just said, it's important to understand why the money is flowing more smoothly to to mitigation, sorry, than adaptation projects. And on my perspective, donors might favor mitigation projects because success is clear and measurable. It can be quantified by the avoided or captured carbon emissions, whereas it's easy to define successful adaptation. Another reason for the imbalance between mitigation and adaptation is once again that climate money is increasingly provided as loans rather than grants. And adaptation almost never is a loan given situation. This sort of operation in many cases doesn't generate money back. And this is why private financing particularly almost always seems to go to mitigation projects that can generate returns on investment. So, for adaptation finance to be scaled up, we need to design better frameworks and analysis tools for adaptation, widening the measures of success and returns, build capacity to develop bankable projects under these updated notions of success, and build connections as well between adaptation project developers and investors, the same we do with mitigation projects.
Oh, thank you, Katya. I think this is sorry, personally I'm learning a lot from it, and it's very interesting why more finance flows towards mitigation than adaptation. And I could easily link what Iliana and Katya and the rest say to what Mr. Stanford said. There is a need. Do you think that the lack of scientific data, like Stanford has put it, like for example technology, where tech transfer, Rasta mentioned tech issues of technology and innovation, do you think the lack of scientific data basically to back up adaptation focused proposal could be one of the reason why adaptation projects are not as attractive to people who want to finance issues of climate change? Just a quick highlight out there, especially to you, Stanford. Do you think the lack of course, scientific data? And yes, so Stanford.
Okay, thanks. Uh, you know what? look at generally, I think agricultural projects are a bit risky, especially in the early stages. So for private sector now to come in and invest in adaptation projects, there has to be uh, 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 transparency and also something to motivate them in terms of a return, because obviously they want a return for them to invest into those projects. So definitely issues to do with quality data is key. Quality data in terms of the whole project, in terms of projection in the future, in terms of in terms of each and every stage of the project. Because if I come with my money to invest in a certain project, definitely I want to see something that motivates me to put that money. Otherwise, I think that's the biggest difference between investing in mitigation and adaptation projects. In mitigation projects, you actually see where your money is going. It's way different with adaptation projects, and it's quite the risk is very high. That's why also you find that for those even private sectors who move into adaptation projects, their risk appetite is high because they also want to protect uh, uh, their capital injection. So I think the most important thing is also, especially for developing countries, we don't have those models or the technology to give us quality data, the technology to make quality projections. I think we lack on that aspect, which is also which hinders also the private sector in terms of investments into adaptation. And also the other thing is that most of the adaptation projects, because of the risk involved, uh, governments don't also want to, well, how can I put this? I think government also has a role in terms of minimizing that risk in adaptation project, which means that the government has to come in, maybe also inject capital into the project that de-risks the whole project and also attracts also other investors to come into to come and invest into such a project. So I think these are some of the issues that are required to be dealt with before we really have quality discussions on private investment in adaptation sector. Otherwise, that's why you find that most of the climate finance flows to mitigation, because there is more transparency, there is more quality data in terms of for the outcomes. What exactly do we want to achieve from this project? Do we have a better return after this project its lifetime has ended? So yeah, I think that's my my addition in terms of this.
Iliana?
I don't have such an extensive experience working on adaptation finance projects, definitely not compared to Stan. One thing to take into account is that the private banks, private investors, they also have their own KPIs to meet. So, of course, if there is not a clear baseline and accounting for what it will be the decrease in emissions, the improvement, it's going to be difficult for them to bank on such projects. At the same time, again, maybe on a superficial level, there are different type of adaptation projects. So the waste ones might be more clear ones, but there are difficulties that involve the negotiation process, also the separation of responsibilities. And of course, the tree planting project would look different compared to sea level rise in cities. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you. Rasta?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating question, right? Because I probably think otherwise in terms of, I don't think it's a lack of scientific data that makes adaptation projects less bankable. I think it's the nature of investments. And I have this ambivalence towards data, right? On one side, I do think they're helpful, but also on the other side, I do know that they're extremely overrated and they come with assumptions. There's this really good article from the Washington Post on how flawed our reporting standards are on emissions and inventories and all of that, right? It's blows your mind. It's crazy. So I do think, like for a long time, and I've bugged a lot of leading climate scientists on this, saying that we've had enough science. We need to move to action. And as a youth climate activist, before, well, I guess, I really, like honed on that point is we've had enough science, and they always told me, well, no, you always need more science to understand because without good science you can't. So I think science is very important, of course, perhaps not so much in shaping the bankability of adaptation finance. I think there are other reasons for that, but I do think um, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and the co-benefits thing. I think Ilyana, you talked about. There's some hope on that as well, right? Like how do we sort of think this differently? Our co-benefits and an avenue through which we can sort of ensure that adaptations coming into these mitigation projects, like and things like that. So the ADB has done some really good work on methodologies on estimating and standardizing co-benefits and things, right? Um, so yeah, I think it's a massive challenge, and I don't have a clear answer for this. Of course, I don't think a lot of people do, um, but yeah, I guess I'm going to end by saying I'm hopeful, and hopefully we'll get there.
Thank you, Stan. Katya?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to my point from the last question. So I also agree that it's not only data itself, it's the way that the data that we are looking at that defines the way forward. So I believe that we need to widen the measures of success, and that means bringing into consideration exactly how do we measure benefits, how do we take into account how a project contributes for SDGs, for instance, or how a project contributes for other successful results. And these, for the moment, is not taken into account. We are only seeing our world through the lens of reduction carbon emissions. But in the end, it's not only about that. We need to start emphasize how people can be have a better quality of life designing projects that take into account these other variables, and how this can also increase the profitability of a project because you are avoiding spending more money in other sectors, development, for instance. So I'll end up here, but I also don't have a clear answer. And I believe that my colleagues did a very good job in summarizing the key points for this question. Thanks.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you. That was a very interesting and very insightful round set of questions. I have this one question, very light question, not as heavy as the ones I've asked, because we've seen that a lot of innovation are coming in when it comes to issues of climate finance, and people are defining it for themselves. Some are mobilizing on their own. Do you think this sort of inclusivity will sort of how do I say, influence, let's say, outwardly into the negotiation room, that we might potentially in the future, have a globally agreed definition of climate finance? Let me call it the outward to inwards approach, because inwards is now the negotiation room, then the outward is what happens, people mobilizing on their own and not looking at the $100 billion. Do you think that there is hope that we might one day have a global definition of climate finance? Your opinions? Stanford?
Okay, thanks. Well, you know what? I always like to look back from where we're coming from. At least it gives us another perspective. This climate finance as standardization definition has been discussed for so many years, but unfortunately, there haven't been any agreement in terms of that. I can also add that in the last COP, the COP 26 in Glasgow, Some parties were also blocking some of these discussions pertaining to the definition of climate finance, because once the definition of climate finance is there, it brings a certain aspect of transparency, and also you can know in terms of climate finance flows well, how do I say that word? You can know in terms of the climate finance flows, the type of climate finance flows which have gone to different countries. So it brings that aspect of transparency. But unfortunately, some parties were blocking such kind of discussions in the last COP. So for me, I think there is need for, because definitely if you want to measure something, there has to be some prerequisites, and in terms of climate finance, issues to do with an agreed definition of what constitute climate finance has to be there. I understand that it can be very problematic, because climate finance can mean a lot of things. But at least there has to be a working definition that parties can work with. And in terms of also measuring those climate finance flows to developing countries, I think it makes everything a little bit easier, than now, where you read one document and you read the kind of climate finance flows that they are including, and you compare it to another document, you find that they're two different. No, well, they're the same documents talking of the same thing, but in terms of what they are including in terms of climate finance is totally different. So I think we have to agree. We have to make progress on that aspect. I'm very happy that these are some of the conversations that are happening in terms of the new post 2025 goal, in terms of coming up with a standardization definition for climate finance.
Thank you. Iliana?
This time I will actually bounce to Katya,
Yes.
so that we change the order a little bit.
Yes. Or Katya?
Okay, so now, although a definition would definitely help to advance climate finance negotiations, I don't believe we should categorically state that this is the silver bullet solution for us to progress. So, for instance, it is also important to emphasize other potential barriers to the development of trust that makes negotiations progress, such as the fact that although rich nations have collectively agreed to the $100 billion goal, they made no formal deal on what each party should pay. Instead, countries announced pledges in the hope that others would follow, and this makes the achievement quite uncertain. Other issue is that most of the climate finance is also going to middle-income countries, not the poorest, most vulnerable countries, once again generating mistrust between different groups of negotiation. And finally, frustratingly, is still in 2020 what should surprise us. All fossil fuels are still being subsidized. So how can this pass a clear message on the willingness to solve the climate crisis? So I do believe that the inclusion of non-party actors and new voices in the consultation process will amplify the ability that we have collectively to search for and find a common definition. But I don't believe that it's the unique solution, and also I don't believe that it's only at COPs that this should be done. Spaces like we have here today, us discussing here from different parts of the world, bringing our perspectives to the table, this also contributes for us to at one point come up with a common agreement on the definition and start working on this at a common ground.
Rasta, and then go back to Iliana.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pick up on what Kadia just talked about in terms of what's happening outside of COP, right? So I think, like you've got a lot of work that's being put on in harmonizing taxonomies. China is harmonizing its green finance taxonomy, sustainable finance with the EU, and we need to look at the work done, the incredible work done by Climate Bonds Initiative in their taxonomies and stuff. So I do think there are rooms and there's evidence and success examples on how do we do this right outside of COP, and I think we need to sort of look into and follow through with what's happening with taxonomies and sustainable finance taxonomies, green finance taxonomies. Why do we have so many different financing terms for sustainable green, climate, carbon finance, right? Biodiversity finance now, and I think Hadi, you talked about biodiversity coming into COP, and it's so important because like it is, and how are we going to ensure that we can scale that up as well? So I do think yeah, these are conversations we need to have, and I look forward to sort of following in the coming years in terms of how this sort of gets harmonized and aligned moving forward. Yeah.
Ileana?
Thank you. Well, I would say I'm hopeful too. I think this whole conversation also highlighted we all are, and that the human factor is the most important one in what we do, so that we can improve the quality of life. People can live in better, inclusive, and equal conditions, and just to bring maybe the role of youth under the spotlight. We're witnessing an evolution of youth climate action, and young leaders are taking a more prominent role. And I like to believe that they can bring the innovative solutions that will not only account better for climate finance, but also close the financing gap. You can see behind that I'm in the room with my sister. She's 11. She would be so proud if I mentioned that her favorite YouTuber, Mr. Beast, has started an initiative and crowdfunded 20 billion US dollars last year to plant 20 billion trees. Yeah.
Thank you, Thank you, Ileana. As we set to wind up, I think we can highly agree that we've made progress, not as fast as we had anticipated at COP26. And is it okay to go ahead and say that COP26 has increased access to finance in whatever way? It doesn't have to be a negotiation room, has increased access to finance for basically those who need it, because we know that a lot of work and progress has been made. And do you think that the countries have created the domestic enabling environment to attract, more climate finance, despite the gaps that we've sort of highlighted? So I will start with Katya, then randomly just speak. Yes. Do you think that COP26 has goes access to climate? It's one thing to have the $100 billion. It's another thing to have access to it. So do you think it has increased access to climate finance? Katya?
So I think, to go back to the point that Iliana just mentioned, at this COP, what we have witnessed was a much stronger and cohesive voice of developing nations, stressing that the complexity and technicality of climate finance access and the limited capacity building support and training have been barriers for effective climate action. And developing nations made the case for change, and the urgency of the crisis will also pressure for solutions. So, although not sort out this time, the loss and damage agenda clearly to stay, for instance, and it will come to a point when it will not be possible to continue other pieces of the negotiation without bringing up these answers, which are actually the backbone of trust in climate negotiation. So I think that we are progressing, and that these topics will be key to unlock other agreements that developed nations are expecting.
I will go with Stan.
Okay. I think in terms of COP26 increasing access to climate finance, I don't think so. Um, what I can add is that what COP26 has done is to make the voices louder in terms of what countries require, in terms of the role that developed countries has to play in terms of meeting their pledges, in terms of practical actions for adaptation, for loss and damage, in terms of also the role of the private sector in the whole climate change discussion. We have also seen and read a lot of announcements at COP26, whereby the private sector came together and announced a certain pact in terms of mobilizing climate finance, whereby countries also came together and announced a certain pact in terms of a specific issue. So I think for me, that's progress. COP26 has managed uh, 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 to make different stakeholders or different parties to come together and agree. And also the fact that finally the rule book was agreed upon, was completed. I think it's also progress also in terms of COP26, because this is something which has been going on since the Paris Agreement came into place. So to complete and agree on that Paris rule book, I think it's great progress. Then also you mentioned issues, an issue on how the domestic environment must be for developing countries to attract maybe climate finance. I believe that there is also a room for developing countries to play in terms of mobilizing their own climate finance. There are a lot of innovative, creative mechanisms that countries are coming up with. Most countries are now crafting policies which uh, uh, are more favorable to issues of climate change. Most countries are also coming up with creative mechanisms like national climate funds. Those mechanisms or those funds or vehicles will be used to attract also climate finance. Then also the private sector. Private sector is also playing a critical role. I mean, domestic private sector, whereby countries are now engaging the private sector and discuss and come up together in terms of how they can help in terms of pushing this climate change agenda. So I believe that COP26 has done a lot. There are more positives than negatives in terms of that. And also I believe that governments are doing a lot in terms of their domestic environments so that they can attract quality climate finance. But having said that, I still feel that there is still more to be done, especially on the COP26 side. We can talk about some of these things, we can discuss, we can come together and announce some of these very exciting engagements or pacts. But at the end of the day, practical solutions is what people want. At the end of the day, someone who is in local communities, so they're poor and vulnerable and been impacted by climate change impacts. He or she wants a real action, not some of these pacts which are being announced on social media. So yeah, I think that's my take on this.
Thank you for the insight, Iliana and Rasta.
On top of what Stan was saying, that this COP has been more positive than negative, it has also been necessary. True, the work needs to happen in between. It should be happening all the time. But now we're living more than ever in a time of competing priorities. So there is health, there is social services, defense, trade. And as much as climate change is getting better at being mainstreamed at the different sectors. This just brings attention directly to climate change, and that's what the world is talking in between those 2 weeks. Um, I support in saying what has been the best out of it in terms of access to finance is really what came out in terms of Article 6. And for local authorities, it has really been the stress on multi level governance that would allow cities to do more at the ambition that they would like to have.
Thank you, Liana. Rasta?
Yeah, no, sorry, I need to run to another meeting as well. But very quickly, I agree. And I think I just want to emphasize that it's outside of COP that we need to look into easing the access to finance. And just for me, just something that's frustrating is we've got countries where um, like like one of the big barriers to not having women-led climate foundations or startups or having this unequal access to women is the fact that they can't everything's collateral based lending and women don't get any properties from their parents, or they have all these barriers to have property in the first place. So like we have systemic issues that are preventing us from access to finance. We're not talking about access to climate finance, right? We've got these systemic issues, inequalities, finance for youth, right? Finance
Mm.
for indigenous communities, finance for indigenous knowledge solutions, right? We're in this world where access to finance itself is not equitable and just, right? So we need to start off with that. Then we need to think about access to climate finance, and then we need to talk about access to adaptation finance, right? So obviously, I think, look, this is an area where countries need to do more. It's not about COP. It's about countries. It's about working with local governments, because we really need to empower local governments because they're not. And you've got central planning in places where they're making policies without talking to people on ground. And these policies are outdated and they're sexist and they're misogynistic. They're wrong, and we need to get out of them, right? So I think like, and yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult, but we need to do that.
Thank you, Rasta. Thank you, panelists. As you make your concluding and final remarks, because I think we are just over about an hour, since this is a youth platform, how do you think young people can engage on climate finance issues, not just as COP, because we're at COPs, we came back, we go every day and we come back, we go to KOI and we make a lot of noise and we go for strikes. Apart from to complement our Fridays for Future strike, how do you think young people can engage within the climate finance and climate change, climate action processes at the, let's start at regional level, at, of course, national level, at local level, and of course at the grassroots level? And what in your perspective, what policy frameworks or engagement strategies need to be put in place so that young people can meaningfully and effectively engage on climate finance and climate action each issues? I will start with you, Iliana. Yes.
I enjoyed this discussion very much. I almost don't want it to end. I will try, yeah, to be practical. Actually, I think the youth has a lot to do in terms of knowledge dissemination, but also capacity building and critical thinking. One great example from the city of Bogota in Colombia is that they recently ran youth local council elections. I think the age of the participants was between 18 and 35, so that they can participate and have a voice in local government planning. You have to check actually the age limit. And again, from a finance perspective, I would say that climate action, youth, and finance are intrinsically linked. So young people can participate through crowd sourcing, so coming up with the new ideas, but also individual retail investment and crowdfunding. These are just the examples on the top of my head.
Thank you, Katya.
So first of all, it's worth emphasizing that young people have not passively waited for the invitation to contribute, but they have exercised leadership for years and fought for their voices and action to be taken into account. This said, to include youth in a more meaningful way in climate finance negotiations in particular, it's important to first make sure to involve youth in design of whatever new framework or policy and decision making process from the beginning. And second, provide young people with the support and training they need to succeed, because these are not trivial issues. And I believe as the international climate framework evolves, more and more youth constituency has a more prominent and meaningful role, as we could witness with the language used in the new collective climate finance goal resolution, which mentions youth directly. At the same time, as mentioned many times today, climate action is not only engagement in UNFCCC process, but also an exercise of daily citizenship. So in my opinion, a great part of the required transition results from local action. And this is why I believe that with a solid climate and political education provided in each country is the first step to ensure young people meaningful engagement in climate actions. For instance, on the one hand, promote consciously voting, and on the other, even developing new political leaders and effective ways to foster climate action among youth.
Uh, Thank you, Katya. Rasta, and then we'll finish with Stan.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and I think there's there's a need for youth focused funds like yours, right? Where young people are funded for their ideas. And I think that's extremely important. It's not just for startups, it's not just for technology, but it's also for young people who want to do smaller things. It's like Ileana talked about her little sister, right? Like if a 13-year-old wants to do something on climate, the school needs to have a fund for it. It's not just about this international level, like how the COP will solve it. It's we need to look inwards into our own institutions and sort of look into how young people are being looked at. And I think like we're getting there, but still, like as you pointed out in your question, are we still looked at? And I call myself youth, but are we still calling youth and ourselves that our position is in the street, right? So my background, I used to track climate finance negotiations, Article 9, as a youth delegate to the UN. And that's where I learned everything about climate finance. And that was such a good opportunity for me to start working on climate finance because of everything I learned. And I think we need more of this, right? We need more of young people being mentored. And I was really lucky to be mentored by climate finance experts. They pulled me in because I wanted to be a zookeeper. And that was the plan. And I was mentored into sort of like looking into different options, looking into where there's a need for more young people, right? And I think that's something I try to do personally as well. Like I speak to a lot of young children, like 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds. There's a high school in Texas. I repeatedly sort of like give Zoom lessons, and then sort of we work on climate solutions. And the school has a really good program where they help young people. They have a class on this, right? And they do special projects that relates to climate solutions. And you've got 12-year-olds doing recycling and setting up a rainwater harvesting system. Isn't that incredible? So it's not just about funding and creating something tangible, but it's also about creating a culture where we feel more connected to nature and the environment, and not just feel hopeless about where the future is headed towards, right? So I think we need a lot of things, and I think it ranges from finance to creating a culture to helping young people connect with nature, especially in this urban space. How do you make that space available for young people to see, greenery, right? And things like that. So I'm going to go on this because obviously it's something I feel very passionately about. But I do want to end by saying that the upcoming COP presidencies are looking into this very seriously. And yeah, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for youth to sort of like push some of these innovative ideas, so that the upcoming presidencies are already thinking about this in terms of like how do we make sure this is happening.
Thank you for that. Finally, Stan.
Okay, thanks. Uh, in terms of youth engagement, I believe that governments also have to play a leading role through engaging or involving youth in all discussions pertaining to climate change. I think that's how youth learn in terms of these aspects that we are discussing today and more. So I think that the youth also, they have to claim the space, which means that they know that the youth know that they are the future. So there is need also to claim that climate change space and start leading, providing that climate leadership in different aspects of climate change issues. I think that way it also makes their voice go out there, and it also makes them interact with like-minded people. That's how you meet like-minded people and come together locally, regionally, or internationally, and discuss more on issues of climate change. Then also, one of the speakers touched on the issue of training. I think it's quite it's important. Knowledge management, it has to be done, and I also believe that's the role also of different stakeholders, especially the government, to lead in that aspect, to train the youth in terms of issues of climate change, to train the youth in terms of if it's in negotiation, including them in those processes. It's much better to learn by doing compared to anything else. So involve the youth in the processes. In terms of maybe there are projects which are happening, climate change projects, the stakeholder engagement process, it also has to take into account the voice of the youth, what they think in terms of this project. I think that that way we that's how people learn. That way, that's how people claim this climate change space. That way, that's how leadership is provided.
Thank you, Stan. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our panelists. You've been amazing. And I've personally, as a young person, I have learned a lot that I didn't know, because when you're at COP, you can't follow everything. You can't follow Article 6 is a whole giant. Climate finance is a long giant. There's LTF, there's GCF report to the COP, there's GF report to the COP. There's so much basically that young people, and then there's also side events, so also balancing also becomes, a bit of an issue. But I think having this session has really given me and other young people the big perspective. It's like sort of summarized climate change and climate finance issues that sort of were discussed, and the key critical areas that we need to look into. So on behalf of my team, the GYCAF team, who are very excited to have you here, I want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the knowledge, and of course for the viewers, and thank you for tuning in, and keep watching. Have a good rest of the year. So this will be the last session of basically the GYCAF webinar series, as we basically look to go into the following year. So we have a lot of initiatives planned. So we have a bit of 2 or 3 activities to close the years, not webinars, but like our panelists have said, the real action is not at COPs. Basically, it is outside the negotiation room, it is on the side events, and it is on the ground. So as the GYCAF team, we're going to sort of balance, try to bring a bit of balance, what happens at the negotiations, and also, of course, action on the ground, which is the most important thing. So thank you, and make sure you subscribe to Twitter, follow us Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and thank you, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.